10 prospectors were killed. Over several weeks in Montana's isolated Silver Creek mining district, 10 men disappeared or were found dead, and everyone believed a stolen mining claim was worth more than their lives. By the time the violence finally ended, families had been left without answers, neighboring mining camps had learned to keep their questions to themselves, and a stretch of rugged mountain country that had once promised prosperity became known instead for fear, silence, and whispers that survived far longer than the men who first spoke them. Silver Creek lay deep within the mountains of western Montana, where steep pine-covered ridges folded into narrow valleys carved by cold streams that rushed down from snow-fed peaks. During the height of the mining boom, the region attracted prospectors from nearly every corner of the United States, each convinced that somewhere beneath the rocky ground rested the strike that would transform an ordinary laborer into a wealthy landowner. The journey itself was difficult. Reaching the district often required days of travel over uneven wagon roads before continuing on horseback, along trails that narrowed into little more than winding paths cut between thick forests and exposed cliffs. It was a place where distance created opportunity, but it also created danger. The nearest courthouse could be many hours away under favorable conditions, while the nearest sheriff might not learn of a dispute until several days after it had already turned violent. Communication moved slowly. Weather frequently delayed travelers. Entire camps could remain isolated for weeks, whenever heavy rain or early snowfall blocked mountain passes. In theory, Montana's mining laws offered clear procedures for registering claims and resolving disputes through legal channels. In practice, however, those procedures depended upon officials who were often too far away to intervene before conflicts had already escalated beyond repair. That separation from formal authority produced a culture unlike almost anywhere else in the American frontier. Miners depended heavily upon one another for supplies, labor, and survival, yet they also competed fiercely for the same limited stretches of productive ground. Every newly discovered vein represented possibility. Every neighboring claim represented competition. Trust became valuable, but so did suspicion. Among experienced prospectors, one phrase carried particular weight: claim jumping. The practice itself was deceptively simple. If a miner believed another claim had been abandoned, improperly marked, or insufficiently worked according to mining regulations, he could attempt to occupy it and declare new ownership. Legitimate disputes certainly existed, and courts occasionally settled them, but many conflicts never reached a courtroom. Instead, stronger groups sometimes relied upon intimidation rather than paperwork. Boundary stakes disappeared overnight. Survey markers were quietly moved several yards in one direction. Cabins were vandalized. Livestock wandered away after fences had been mysteriously cut. By the time legal questions reached distant officials, physical control of the land often mattered more than written ownership. For decades, prospectors throughout the region accepted these risks as part of frontier life. Most disagreements remained limited to angry arguments or small acts of sabotage. Fatal violence, although not unheard of, remained relatively uncommon. Everything changed after the discovery beneath Silver Creek. According to later investigative records, several independent prospectors working along a narrow bend of the creek uncovered unusually rich deposits of silver-bearing ore, unlike anything previously documented in the surrounding district. Samples transported to local buyers reportedly suggested extraordinary purity. Word spread quickly despite repeated attempts to keep the discovery quiet. Within weeks, new tents appeared along nearby ridges. Supply wagons increased. Merchants began extending additional credit to miners they believed might soon become wealthy customers. One productive claim could change an entire family's future. A single legally recognized mining parcel, if supported by a rich vein extending beneath adjoining ground, could generate profits beyond anything most laborers had imagined earning during their lifetime. Ownership was no longer merely about land. It represented inheritance, security, respect, escape from poverty. That possibility attracted honest prospectors. It also attracted dishonest ones. Long before any shooting began, quiet conversations started circulating through boarding houses, supply stores, and campfire gatherings. Nobody seemed willing to repeat the rumors too loudly. Nevertheless, nearly everyone appeared to have heard some version of the same story. Someone had begun forcing neighboring claim holders away from valuable ground. No one could identify precisely who. No one admitted witnessing direct threats. But the stories continued. One miner reportedly discovered freshly driven boundary stakes several yards inside his registered property. Another returned from purchasing supplies to find strangers occupying part of his work area while insisting they possessed equal rights to the ground. Others claimed mounted riders had begun appearing along nearby ridgelines, watching work crews from a distance before disappearing into the trees whenever anyone attempted to approach them. None of these incidents, viewed individually, proved organized criminal activity. Together, however, they created unease. Life inside Silver Creek slowly changed. Camp conversations became shorter whenever unfamiliar faces approached. Men who had previously left tools unattended now locked equipment inside rough timber sheds each evening. Partners altered work schedules so that no one remained alone for extended periods. Even routine trips to nearby streams for fresh water were increasingly made in pairs rather than individually. The atmosphere itself seemed different, not openly hostile, simply watchful. One afternoon, according to accounts later collected from surviving residents of neighboring camps, several prospectors traveling between excavation sites encountered 3 mounted riders positioned silently along an elevated section of trail overlooking Silver Creek. The riders carried rifles across their saddles but made no immediate threats. They asked few questions. They simply watched the passing miners with unusual patience before turning their horses and disappearing back into dense timber. Nothing illegal had occurred. Nothing could be reported beyond suspicion. Yet the encounter spread through camp before sunset. Within only a few days, visible changes became impossible to ignore. Rifles that had previously remained hanging inside cabins were now carried openly during ordinary work. Revolvers appeared beneath heavy coats despite warm weather. Extra ammunition quietly disappeared from general stores. Nobody announced these precautions publicly. Nobody organized formal defenses. Each man simply reached the same conclusion independently. Something was changing. No one knew exactly what, but everyone felt it. Meanwhile, another development attracted surprisingly little attention at first. Survey markers. The narrow wooden stakes marking individual mining boundaries had always required regular inspection because weather, wildlife, and natural erosion frequently displaced them. Prospectors routinely walked property lines every few days, confirming that markers remained visible and accurately positioned. It was ordinary work, tedious work, usually uneventful. Then one inspection failed to end normally. Late one afternoon, one of the prospectors assigned to verify boundary stakes left camp, carrying only basic surveying equipment and a rolled mining claim map. Fellow workers expected him back before sunset. He never returned. At first, no one panicked. Delays happened. Trails became difficult after dark. Horses occasionally wandered. Morning came. His horse returned alone. Search parties followed sections of the boundary line for hours before eventually locating disturbed ground near several freshly driven stakes. The survey map had vanished. The prospector himself had vanished as well. There were no confirmed witnesses, no immediate suspects, no obvious explanation. And once again, despite growing fear throughout Silver Creek, the official response changed nothing. No arrests were made. By the time fear began settling over Silver Creek, most of the men living there had already accepted one unavoidable truth about life in Montana's mining country. The mountains rewarded patience, punished carelessness, and rarely offered second chances. Every successful prospector understood that fortune belonged not only to those who worked the hardest, but to those willing to endure months of disappointment while continuing to believe that the next shovel of earth might uncover something extraordinary. It was that quiet optimism, more than greed, that had brought dozens of experienced miners into the valley. Among them were 4 men whose names would eventually come to define the tragedy that followed. Walter Harlan was 44 years old and had spent more than 2 decades following mining camps across the American West. Unlike many prospectors, Walter believed that success depended as much upon careful records as hard labor. Every claim he inspected, every boundary stake he verified, every conversation concerning ownership eventually found its way into a weathered leather notebook that rarely left his possession. Fellow miners often joked that Walter trusted ink more than memory. According to later testimony from those who knew him, he considered written documentation to be the only protection a miner truly possessed once disagreements reached a courtroom. He also followed routines with remarkable consistency. Nearly every morning before sunrise, regardless of weather, Walter rode the same northern trail to inspect the outer boundary markers surrounding his claim. Few people questioned the habit because consistency had served him well throughout his career. He often remarked that this season would be his last. If the Silver Creek vein proved as rich as early samples suggested, he intended to retire before another Montana winter arrived. Not far from Walter's cabin worked Earl McKinney, a 37-year-old former blacksmith, whose powerful hands had spent years repairing wagon wheels, horseshoes, and mining tools long before he ever searched for silver himself. Earl possessed skills that made him indispensable inside the camp. Broken pickaxes, damaged ore carts, bent drill heads, fractured harness buckles. Nearly every piece of equipment eventually found its way to Earl's small forge. He accepted payment when offered, but just as often completed repairs simply because another miner needed help finishing the day's work. Despite his physical strength, Earl disliked unnecessary displays of violence. He carried a revolver only because frontier life demanded it, and according to longtime co-workers, he refused to load more ammunition than absolutely necessary. His reasoning remained simple. A firearm existed to discourage trouble, not invite it. Few men argued with him because Earl rarely argued with anyone. The youngest of the four anchor figures was Clyde Mercer, only 29 years old, recently married, and still speaking about the future with the confidence of someone who believed life had barely begun. His wife remained several hundred miles away while he worked what both hoped would become their final mining season apart. Every Sunday evening, regardless of exhaustion, Clyde wrote a letter before darkness settled over the valley. Friends occasionally teased him for never missing a week, but he insisted that promises mattered more than convenience. Although Clyde had earned a reputation as one of the finest marksmen in the district after years of hunting throughout the mountain wilderness, that ability never translated into aggression. According to those who later described his character, Clyde avoided confrontations whenever possible. He preferred patience over pride and conversation over conflict. Watching over the daily operation stood Harvey Sloan, 51 years old, respected by nearly everyone who passed through Silver Creek. Harvey had gradually become the camp's unofficial foreman, not because he sought authority, but because other miners naturally trusted his judgment whenever disagreements appeared. He understood paperwork better than most prospectors, and quietly kept duplicate ownership documents secured inside a heavy wooden supply chest stored in his cabin. His habit frustrated some neighbors who believed such caution unnecessary among honest men. Harvey disagreed. Documents could burn, cabins could flood. Accidents happened. Duplicate records prevented honest mistakes from becoming permanent losses. Yet, for all his practical caution regarding paperwork, Harvey remained remarkably trusting of people. He believed disagreements could almost always be resolved through conversation if everyone approached them honestly. Around these four men worked 6 additional prospectors who had partnered together on neighboring claims for several seasons. They shared equipment, exchanged labor whenever excavation became difficult, and divided responsibilities according to experience rather than strict ownership lines. Although each legally maintained separate claims, daily life blurred those distinctions. Meals were shared, repairs were shared, risks were shared. Success, they hoped, would eventually be shared as well. For several weeks after the first unexplained disappearance near the boundary stakes, life attempted to return to something resembling normal. Picks struck rock before sunrise. Ore wagons continued making slow trips toward local buyers. Smoke drifted upward from blacksmith fires each evening. Yet beneath that familiar routine, subtle changes accumulated almost unnoticed. The first involved fencing. One morning, several miners discovered that a stretch of timber fencing marking the edge of one claim had been cleanly cut during the night. Nothing appeared stolen. Livestock remained nearby. The damage itself could easily have been dismissed as ordinary vandalism, or perhaps even weather, had the cuts not appeared unusually deliberate. Fresh tool marks remained visible across several posts, according to later descriptions. The damaged section faced directly toward disputed mining ground. No arrests were made. The incident might have faded into memory had another problem not emerged only days later. Several carefully labeled ore samples disappeared from a secured storage shed, awaiting transport for independent evaluation. Their market value remained relatively modest, but their significance extended far beyond simple profit. Those samples represented evidence supporting future ownership claims, because they demonstrated where valuable mineral deposits had been discovered. Without them, proving the richness of a particular section of ground became more complicated. Walter Harlan immediately compared his written records against older survey notes inside his leather notebook, convinced that preserving documentation mattered even more now than before. No arrests were made. Conversation throughout Silver Creek gradually changed tone. Men no longer discussed the quality of ore or expected prices as freely as they once had. Instead, attention shifted toward unfamiliar faces appearing along supply routes. Every stranger became memorable. Every passing rider received longer looks than before. Suspicion spread without attaching itself firmly to anyone. Then came the horses. According to later accounts, several work animals were found wandering loose before dawn, after someone opened their enclosures during the night. The timing proved unusually disruptive because transportation remained essential for hauling equipment across the steep mountain terrain. Fortunately, the animals were recovered before disappearing into the surrounding wilderness. Even so, the event consumed valuable hours and left camp residents wondering whether inconvenience, rather than outright theft, had been the intended objective. No arrests were made. By now, even Earl McKinney, who had always discouraged unnecessary fear, quietly inspected every revolver brought into his workshop, making small repairs without increasing his own ammunition. His principles had not changed. He still believed carrying excessive rounds encouraged bad decisions. But he also understood that responsible equipment could become essential if circumstances continued deteriorating. Walter maintained his morning rides along the northern trail exactly as before, refusing to abandon routines that had protected his claims for years. Harvey carefully reorganized the duplicate ownership papers inside his supply chest, explaining only that important records deserved careful handling. Clyde folded another letter to his wife before sealing the envelope, never mentioning the growing tension because he preferred to protect her from worries he believed might soon disappear. Instead, they grew worse. Late one evening, as darkness settled over the valley and lantern light flickered between scattered cabins, a single rifle shot echoed across the hillsides. It struck neither man nor building. According to later testimony, the bullet buried itself harmlessly into a weathered pine several dozen yards beyond camp. Whoever fired it had almost certainly intended the sound, not the impact, to carry the message. Silence followed. No one pursued the shooter into the darkness. No arrests were made. The final warning arrived without gunfire. Near sunrise, an unidentified rider approached within sight of the camp, slowed only long enough to leave a folded scrap of paper wedged beneath a boundary stake, then turned his horse and disappeared before anyone reached him. The note contained no signature. It offered no legal argument. It simply warned that some claims no longer belonged to the men working them. Everyone suspected someone. Nobody could prove anything. And once again, despite mounting intimidation, despite disappearing evidence, despite unmistakable signs that someone intended to seize control of Silver Creek by fear rather than law, the official record remained unchanged. No arrests were made. After weeks of scattered intimidation, the pattern changed. Individual acts of harassment, each of which could once have been dismissed as coincidence or petty rivalry, began occurring so frequently that even the most optimistic men in Silver Creek could no longer pretend they were unrelated. According to later investigative reviews, what emerged was not random frontier misfortune, but a deliberate progression, each incident testing how far the prospectors could be pushed before someone finally abandoned the disputed ground. The first unmistakable escalation arrived shortly before dawn when flames appeared on the eastern edge of camp. One of the smaller mining cabins, used primarily for storing blasting tools and food supplies, had caught fire during the night. By the time neighboring miners reached the structure with buckets drawn from the creek, the roof had already collapsed inward, sending showers of sparks into the cold mountain air. Little remained worth saving. Fortunately, no one had been sleeping inside, but the destruction carried a message that extended far beyond the value of the building itself. Cabins could be rebuilt. Confidence could not. Investigators would later conclude only that the origin of the fire could not be determined with certainty. Those living in Silver Creek reached their own conclusions much sooner. Walter Harlan stood silently beside the smoking ruins after sunrise, making careful notes inside his weathered leather notebook, while comparing the damaged structure against the original layout of the camp. The notebook had gradually become more than a personal habit. It had become a record of every irregular event surrounding the disputed claims. Every missing tool, every altered boundary, every suspicious encounter. Walter believed that if enough facts were gathered, the truth would eventually become impossible to ignore. Others wished they shared his confidence. Only 3 mornings later, another discovery deepened those fears. Fresh claim markers appeared where none had stood the previous evening. Several wooden boundary stakes had been removed and replaced during the night, shifting portions of disputed property several yards away from their documented locations. To an outsider, the change appeared insignificant. To experienced miners, it represented something entirely different. Mining law depended heavily upon clearly established boundaries. Even a relatively small alteration could later become the foundation for an ownership dispute worth thousands of dollars if left unchallenged. Walter immediately compared the newly positioned stakes against the measurements preserved in his notebook. They did not match. Neither did Harvey Sloan's duplicate ownership records, carefully protected inside the heavy supply chest he had maintained since arriving at Silver Creek. The paperwork and the landscape no longer agreed with one another. Someone had physically begun rewriting the mountain. Conversations throughout camp grew shorter. Meals became quieter. Men who had once debated ore quality now discussed only routes, watches, and precautions. Nobody openly accused any particular individual because no evidence pointed toward a specific suspect. Yet the feeling that unseen eyes watched every movement had become impossible to dismiss. The next attack focused not on property lines, but on the practical realities of survival. An ore wagon scheduled to transport several days' worth of extracted silver-bearing rock suffered a catastrophic axle failure while descending a narrow trail leading away from camp. Earl McKinney reached the scene shortly afterward and immediately recognized damage inconsistent with ordinary wear. According to later testimony from neighboring miners, several securing pins appeared to have been deliberately loosened before the wagon departed. Earl spent hours repairing the broken axle beside the trail, saying little as, "He worked," but those nearby noticed something unusual. Although he continued carrying only the limited ammunition he believed necessary, he no longer left his revolver hanging inside the blacksmith shed while making repairs. His principles had not changed, his caution had. Even after restoring the wagon, Earl quietly inspected every remaining bolt himself before allowing anyone to continue hauling ore. The incidents continued. Then came the warning that no one expected. A local merchant who regularly supplied flour, lamp oil, blasting powder, and replacement tools requested a private conversation with Harvey Sloan before unloading his wagon. According to Harvey's later account, the merchant appeared unusually nervous, repeatedly looking toward the surrounding hills before speaking. He claimed to have overheard conversations during a recent supply stop, suggesting that several influential men believed the Silver Creek dispute would soon resolve itself because the right people intended to take control of the claims. He offered no names, no written evidence, only advice. Leave while leaving remained possible. Harvey thanked him for the warning, but declined the suggestion. Abandoning legally registered claims after months of exhausting work would effectively reward whoever had begun the intimidation campaign. Walter agreed. Earl agreed. Clyde Mercer, despite being the youngest among them, reached the same conclusion. None believed retreat would guarantee safety. It would merely surrender everything they had earned. For the first time since arriving at Silver Creek, Harvey gathered the principal prospectors together after sunset and suggested a change in routine. No one should work alone. No one should travel isolated trails. Every inspection of disputed property should involve multiple men. The proposal received immediate support. Even those who rarely expressed fear recognized that the mountain had changed. The following week, the prospectors decided to seek formal assistance. A written complaint describing the burned cabin, altered boundary markers, sabotaged equipment, and growing intimidation was delivered to local authorities. Walter carefully organized supporting notes from his leather notebook. Harvey included duplicate ownership documents establishing the original claim boundaries. Together, they believed the pattern had finally become substantial enough to demand official intervention. The response proved deeply disappointing. According to surviving records referenced in later reviews of the case, authorities acknowledged receiving the complaint, but concluded that the available evidence remained insufficient to identify specific suspects or justify immediate legal action. Fires could begin accidentally. Boundary disputes occurred regularly throughout mining districts. Equipment failures happened. Anonymous warnings carried little evidentiary value. The prospectors left with paperwork, not protection. No arrests were made. The repeated refrain spread through camp almost as bitterly as the original threats. No arrests were made. Days later, another unexpected visitor arrived. Unlike the merchant, this individual refused to reveal his identity. According to accounts later preserved by investigators, the unidentified witness approached the edge of camp shortly before sunset, spoke briefly with two miners, then disappeared before anyone could ask additional questions. His information, however, remained remarkably specific. Several armed men, he claimed, had recently occupied abandoned cabins overlooking the upper section of Silver Creek. They rarely entered town. They traveled mostly after dark. They appeared to be watching the disputed mining ground rather than working claims of their own. Search parties considered investigating immediately. Harvey urged restraint. Without knowing exactly who occupied those cabins, or whether the information itself had been planted as a trap, charging blindly into unfamiliar terrain risked provoking precisely the confrontation everyone hoped to avoid. Walter instead concentrated on preparing a formal legal challenge. Evening after evening, he sat beneath lantern light, comparing survey measurements, ownership filings, boundary sketches, and handwritten observations inside his leather notebook. Every page represented another attempt to replace rumor with evidence. If intimidation had become organized, then documentation would have to become equally organized. Meanwhile, Harvey removed the duplicate ownership papers from the supply chest and began carrying them personally whenever discussions involved the disputed claims. The documents no longer seemed secure inside a cabin that might easily become the next target. Clyde Mercer also adjusted his habits. Although he still preferred avoiding conflict whenever possible, he quietly carried the rifle whose accuracy had earned him respect throughout the district. Friends noticed the change but understood the reason. Clyde had not become more aggressive. The situation had become more dangerous. Earl completed one final inspection of the repaired ore wagon, tightening every bolt by hand before declaring it ready for another journey. Few realized that simple repair would later become one of the final ordinary tasks he ever performed. By then, nearly everyone recognized the truth they had resisted for weeks. This was no longer a campaign of intimidation. Someone intended to erase ownership itself. If legitimate claim holders disappeared, abandoned property could eventually become available for others to occupy. The mountain was no longer simply being contested. It was being cleared. Even so, abandoning the claims remained almost unthinkable. Months of labor, thousands of dollars in equipment, and the possibility of extraordinary wealth rested beneath that rocky ground. Walking away would preserve their lives, perhaps, but it would destroy the future each man had imagined. Walter still believed the law would ultimately prevail if enough evidence reached the proper authorities. Harvey believed staying together offered their best chance of preventing violence. Earl believed preparation mattered more than panic. Clyde believed promises deserved keeping, including the promise that this would be the last season before returning permanently to his wife. So they made one final decision. The entire group would ride together at first light to inspect the disputed claims, verify every boundary marker, compare the measurements against Walter's notebook and Harvey's duplicate records, and settle the ownership questions before submitting their complete evidence. None of them knew that the men watching from the surrounding ridges had already made plans of their own. The morning chosen for the final inspection arrived cold and unusually clear. According to the later reconstruction, assembled from surviving records and testimony gathered after the fact, visibility across the upper slopes of Silver Creek extended for nearly half a mile, with only scattered pine stands interrupting the view between the lower trail and the disputed ridge. It appeared, at first glance, to be the safest morning the prospectors had seen in weeks. That impression would last only a few minutes. At approximately 7:18 a.m., the group of 10 prospectors reached the first line of disputed boundary markers. Walter Harlan rode slightly ahead, exactly as he had done countless mornings before along his familiar northern trail. His weathered leather notebook rested inside his saddlebag, alongside carefully folded survey sketches that he intended to compare against the markers driven into the rocky ground. Harvey Sloan rode only a short distance behind him, carrying the duplicate ownership papers he no longer trusted to leave inside the camp supply chest. Earl McKinney remained toward the center of the group beside the repaired ore wagon, having personally tightened every axle pin the previous evening. Clyde Mercer rode near the rear, his rifle secured across the saddle. It was the same rifle he rarely carried openly before the intimidation began. For several moments, nothing seemed unusual. The men dismounted. Walter walked toward the first boundary stake. Harvey unfolded the property records. Several others spread out to inspect the remaining markers. At approximately 7:24 a.m., movement appeared above the tree line. One rider, then another, then several more. According to investigators' later reconstruction, armed horsemen emerged almost simultaneously from multiple elevated positions overlooking the ridge. They held the high ground. They had clear fields of view. Their approach suggested planning rather than coincidence. No one below had expected an attack to begin in daylight. Walter saw them first. He raised one hand, not a weapon, an open hand. At approximately 7:26 a.m., he stepped several feet forward and attempted to speak before anyone reached for a firearm. According to later testimony, his intention appeared consistent with the approach he had favored throughout the dispute. Documentation first, conversation second, violence only as a last resort. The response came before any negotiation could begin. A rifle cracked across the ridge, then another. Everything changed. The first shot struck the ground around the prospectors, sending fragments of rock and dirt across the trail. Horses panicked instantly, pulling against their reins as echoes rolled through the valley. Men scattered. Someone shouted for cover. Several rushed toward a cluster of boulders bordering the trail. Others dropped behind the ore wagon. At approximately 7:28 a.m., Harvey Sloan reached for the leather document case containing the duplicate ownership papers he had insisted on bringing himself. According to investigators, he appeared determined to protect the records despite the gunfire. He never reached safety. Another shot. Harvey fell beside the open case. The documents scattered across the rocky ground before disappearing beneath frightened horses and blowing dust. Only moments earlier, those papers had represented the legal proof of ownership. Now they lay exposed in the middle of an ambush. Walter attempted to reach him. Instead, he turned back toward the notebook still secured inside his saddlebag, perhaps believing the written survey records remained equally important if the dispute ever reached a courtroom. According to later investigative findings, that notebook was never recovered. At approximately 7:30 a.m., Clyde Mercer finally returned fire. The hesitation that had defined his character throughout the dispute disappeared only because every peaceful option had already failed. Friends had long admired his marksmanship, while also knowing how carefully he avoided unnecessary confrontation. Now that same skill briefly altered the course of the attack. His first shots forced several mounted attackers behind trees along the ridge. Another rider pulled back uphill. For perhaps a minute, maybe slightly longer according to later estimates, the volume of incoming fire decreased. It was enough to allow several prospectors to move toward heavier cover, not enough to escape. Clyde shifted positions again. He fired once more. Then the attackers adjusted. Their elevated position left almost no safe route forward, almost no safe route backward. As Clyde attempted to move between two large granite outcrops, additional rifle fire swept across the narrow opening. He disappeared from view. The rifle fell silent. At approximately 7:33 a.m., Earl McKinney made the decision that several surviving accounts would later remember most clearly. He did not charge the attackers. He did not pursue revenge. Instead, true to the temperament that had defined him long before violence reached Silver Creek, Earl ran toward another wounded miner lying exposed beside the damaged wagon. According to later testimony, he attempted to pull the injured man behind cover rather than protect himself. He almost succeeded. Another volley crossed the trail. Both men collapsed before reaching the rocks. The attack continued. The remaining prospectors broke apart into smaller groups, each searching desperately for any path through the surrounding timber. Some attempted climbing the western slope. Others fled toward the creek below. The attackers maintained their advantage, firing from above, while cutting off the most obvious escape routes. The organized inspection had become complete chaos. According to investigators' later reconstruction, several victims were overtaken while attempting to reach the forest. Others disappeared into dense timber and were never seen alive again. Exactly how every individual died could not be established with certainty, but evidence recovered afterward indicated the violence unfolded across multiple locations rather than a single battlefield. Less than 20 minutes after the first riders appeared above the tree line, the shooting stopped. Silence returned almost as suddenly as it had been broken. The attackers withdrew, the ridge emptied. Only abandoned equipment, frightened horses, scattered documents, and the aftermath remained. When neighboring miners eventually reached the disputed claims, after learning that the inspection party had failed to return, they encountered a scene investigators would later describe as deeply disturbing. The ore wagon stood, abandoned where Earl had left it. Survey markers remained scattered across the ground. Several horses wandered riderless between the trees. The camp itself offered no comfort. Cabins stood open. Personal belongings remained inside. Meals had been left unfinished. Yet two items immediately drew attention because of their absence. Harvey Sloan's duplicate ownership papers had vanished. Walter Harlan's leather notebook had vanished as well. Investigators later regarded both disappearances as significant because they removed the very documents capable of proving the original ownership of the disputed mining claims. Whether those records had been specifically targeted or simply taken during the confusion could never be established with certainty. What remained undeniable, however, was the human cost. 10 prospectors had entered the disputed ridge that morning, believing they were protecting lawful claims. None returned together. Search parties spent the following days recovering the dead and searching for those still missing across the surrounding mountains. Families waited for news. Fellow miners retraced trails already stained by violence. Hope steadily disappeared with every passing hour. When the final recovery efforts ended, the official count stood at 10 victims. And once again, despite the scale of the killings, despite the missing records, despite evidence that the attack had been carefully organized rather than spontaneous, the immediate legal outcome remained exactly as it had after every warning that came before. No arrests were made. When the shooting stopped, the violence ended. The silence did not. In the days that followed the attack at Silver Creek, neighboring miners who had avoided the disputed claims out of fear gradually returned to recover abandoned equipment, identify the dead, and account for those who had failed to come home. According to the later reconstruction of events, the mining district that had once echoed with blasting charges, wagon wheels, and blacksmith hammers became unusually quiet, as though the mountain itself had become a witness that refused to speak. The initial investigation began almost immediately, at least in appearance. The local sheriff traveled to Silver Creek, accompanied by a small number of deputies, surveyed the ridge where the attack had occurred, examined the scattered equipment that remained behind, and questioned every miner willing to stay in the district long enough to provide a statement. Disturbed earth, spent cartridge cases, damaged wagons, abandoned tools, and scattered personal belongings all confirmed that a violent confrontation had taken place. What they did not establish was who had carried it out. Nearly every surviving miner described seeing armed horsemen. Almost none claimed they could identify a single face. Some insisted the attackers wore scarves across the lower half of their faces. Others remembered only broad hats pulled low against the morning sun. Several admitted they had spent most of the attack trying to reach cover rather than studying the men firing from above. Investigators recorded statement after statement. Each added another fragment. None completed the picture. The missing documents quickly became one of the investigation's central concerns. Walter Harlan's leather notebook had vanished. Harvey Sloan's duplicate ownership records had vanished as well. Those two collections represented the most complete written record of the disputed claims, including measurements, survey notes, ownership history, and observations documenting the growing intimidation campaign. According to investigators, whoever removed them had taken far more than paper. They had removed the strongest documentary evidence connecting the murders to the larger struggle over ownership. Without those records, proving motive became substantially more difficult. The investigation nevertheless continued, for a short time. As the weeks passed, another troubling pattern emerged. Witnesses who had initially spoken with confidence began changing their stories. One miner who had previously claimed to recognize a distinctive horse among the attackers later insisted he had been mistaken. Another withdrew portions of his original statement after saying he no longer wished to become involved. A third admitted privately that remaining in Silver Creek with a family to protect made public testimony difficult, then declined to provide further information. According to later investigators, fear appeared to spread faster than evidence. No one openly admitted being threatened. Many behaved as though they had been. Meanwhile, attention shifted toward the companies and investors who stood to benefit financially from the disputed mining ground. Lawyers representing commercial mining interests firmly denied any involvement in the violence, maintaining that ownership disagreements should be resolved only through established legal procedures. No documentary evidence available during the original investigation directly contradicted those denials. Legally, the statement stood. Publicly, suspicion remained. Then came another development that deepened those suspicions. Within a relatively short period after the killings, portions of the disputed claims were transferred through apparently lawful filings into new ownership. According to later reviews of county land records, the paperwork itself appeared procedurally valid. The signatures met legal requirements. Filing fees had been paid. Survey descriptions accompanied the transfers. What those documents could not explain was why so many original owners had disappeared before those transactions occurred. Questions multiplied. Answers did not. As months became years, physical evidence gradually disappeared. Some materials deteriorated naturally beneath harsh Montana winters. Other items simply could no longer be located. Storage practices during that era were inconsistent, particularly for investigations conducted far from major population centers. According to later reviews, portions of the original case file eventually became incomplete, making reconstruction increasingly difficult. The active investigation slowed, then slowed again. Eventually, it stopped. The file remained officially open. Functionally, it became inactive. Silver Creek itself also changed. Some miners abandoned the district entirely, unwilling to risk another confrontation. Others remained only long enough to recover equipment before moving to newer discoveries elsewhere across the west. Cabins collapsed beneath heavy snow. Trails narrowed beneath growing timber. The ridge where 10 prospectors had gathered gradually returned to silence. For the families left behind, however, time never truly closed the wound. Walter Harlan's relatives continued searching for any surviving copy of the records he had spent years compiling. They believed his meticulous habits meant duplicates might exist somewhere beyond Silver Creek. None were found. Harvey Sloan's descendants repeatedly questioned why a man known for preserving important documents had left behind no trace of the duplicate ownership papers he considered indispensable. They could not accept that both copies had simply vanished by chance. Clyde Mercer's widow preserved every weekly letter he had written throughout the mining season. According to later family accounts, she continued reading them for years after his death, holding on to the promise that Silver Creek would be his final assignment before returning home permanently. Earl McKinney's former co-workers remembered him differently. They rarely spoke about firearms. Instead, they remembered repaired wagons, sharpened tools, and a man who believed helping others mattered more than winning arguments. The decision he made during the attack to pull another injured miner toward safety instead of protecting himself matched exactly the life they believed he had always lived. Years became decades. The expectation of justice slowly gave way to resignation. Children who had once waited for fathers grew into adults with children of their own. Families marked anniversaries quietly. Newspapers mentioned the massacre only occasionally, usually in retrospective pieces examining Montana's unsettled mining history. The official file gathered dust. Then, when almost no one still expected progress, hope unexpectedly returned. According to later investigative records, a retired stable owner contacted authorities claiming he had carried a secret for many years. During the period surrounding the Silver Creek killings, he had allegedly provided horses and supplies to several unfamiliar riders traveling through the district. Time, age, and failing health, he reportedly admitted, had finally convinced him to speak. Investigators arranged a formal meeting. Preparations began. For the first time in years, surviving family members believed someone might finally identify at least one of the gunmen who had escaped the ridge. The stable owner reportedly began organizing his memories before the interview. According to investigators, he intended to provide a handwritten statement identifying one surviving participant and describing movements he had witnessed shortly before the massacre. The appointment was scheduled. The case, it seemed, was finally moving again. Days before the meeting could take place, everything collapsed. The retired stable owner died unexpectedly. When investigators searched county records for the handwritten statement he had reportedly prepared, they were unable to locate it. Whether it had never been formally submitted, had been misplaced, or had disappeared afterward, could not be determined with certainty during later reviews. The promised breakthrough vanished with him. Families who had waited decades for answers found themselves beginning the wait once more. The investigation slowed, then stopped, again. And despite another opportunity slipping away, despite a witness who had appeared ready to identify one of the surviving gunmen, despite renewed public interest in the forgotten massacre, the official outcome remained painfully familiar. No arrests were made. Decades passed before anyone realized that the final pieces of the Silver Creek mystery had never truly disappeared. They had simply remained buried beneath layers of forgotten paperwork, abandoned ownership claims, and the assumption that the massacre belonged permanently to history. Time had changed the mountain. Trees now covered portions of trails once worn smooth by ore wagons. Cabins had collapsed into weathered foundations. Boundary stakes had long since rotted away. Yet the legal questions surrounding the original mining claims had never been completely settled. According to the later reconstruction of the investigation, the case returned unexpectedly through a modern land ownership dispute rather than a homicide inquiry. Surveyors reviewing historical mining boundaries encountered inconsistencies between surviving county filings and several 19th-century claim descriptions that appeared impossible to reconcile. Acreage totals failed to match. Property lines overlapped in ways that earlier survey methods could not adequately explain. The discrepancies initially appeared to be routine archival errors. Instead, they became the reason investigators reopened records that had remained largely untouched for generations. The renewed review expanded beyond county registries into private collections, probate inventories, and abandoned business records connected to long-defunct mining partnerships. During that process, according to the official reconstruction, workers cataloging the contents of a deteriorating storage building discovered an aging wooden trunk that had apparently remained unopened for decades. The container itself seemed unremarkable. Dust covered its iron fittings. Moisture had stained portions of the exterior. Nothing about its appearance suggested it contained evidence capable of reshaping one of Montana's oldest unsolved frontier massacres. Inside, investigators found exactly what Silver Creek had been missing: Harvey Sloan's duplicate ownership papers. Folded carefully, despite years of storage, the documents matched descriptions preserved in scattered family correspondence. The original claim boundaries remained intact. Filing dates aligned with surviving county records. More importantly, the paperwork demonstrated that the disputed mining ground had been lawfully claimed before the later ownership transfers occurred. Beneath Harvey's records lay another remarkable discovery: Walter Harlan's leather notebook. For decades, Walter's relatives had believed the notebook represented the single most important missing artifact connected to the case. They had been correct. Every habit that had once prompted fellow miners to joke about Walter's obsession with documentation suddenly became invaluable. His daily entries reconstructed the growing intimidation campaign in careful chronological order. Dates matched surviving newspaper accounts. Measurements corresponded with original surveys. Individual incidents that had once appeared isolated now formed a continuous pattern leading directly toward the morning of the massacre. Investigators no longer relied upon memory alone. Walter had preserved the timeline himself. The discoveries continued. Hidden beneath the notebook and ownership papers rested financial ledgers, documenting payments moving through several interconnected business interests shortly before the killings. According to forensic accounting conducted during the modern investigation, the transactions suggested that substantial sums had been directed toward individuals who possessed no legitimate ownership interest in Silver Creek, but maintained documented connections to groups involved in aggressive claim acquisition elsewhere in the region. On their own, the ledgers established suspicious financial activity. Combined with another collection of documents recovered inside the same trunk, they became significantly more powerful. Investigators also located signed correspondence linking influential claim jumpers to men believed, according to the reconstructed evidence, to have served as hired enforcers during the period surrounding the massacre. The letters did not explicitly describe murder. They did, however, discuss removing obstacles, securing disputed property, protecting investments, and ensuring that ownership questions reached a final settlement before additional legal challenges could be filed. Placed beside Walter's notebook, Harvey's ownership papers, and the financial records, investigators concluded that the documents formed a coherent narrative rather than unrelated historical artifacts. For the first time, motive, opportunity, planning, and financial benefit aligned within a single evidentiary framework. Modern investigators spent months reconstructing the complete ownership history surrounding Silver Creek. Survey specialists compared Walter's measurements against surviving geological maps. Every entry inside the notebook corresponded remarkably well with original boundary locations. Harvey's duplicate documents confirmed which claims had existed before the intimidation campaign began. The original survey maps, once thought permanently lost, effectively demonstrated that later property transfers rested upon boundaries altered after the lawful owners had disappeared. The mountain had not changed, the paperwork had. Genealogists joined the investigation next, tracing family relationships through probate files, census records, historical deeds, and archived correspondence. Although many direct participants had died decades earlier, investigators identified surviving descendants connected to several principal conspirators and reconstructed ownership chains that extended from the original, disputed claims into later commercial mining operations. Their work established how financial benefits continued flowing long after the violence itself had ended. The legal process that followed reflected the passage of time. According to the historical record, many of those believed to have planned or carried out the conspiracy were no longer alive. Criminal prosecution therefore focused only upon surviving participants where legally possible, while additional proceedings addressed fraudulent property transfers and historical findings connected to the estates that had benefited from the scheme. The courtroom proceedings became less about punishment than about establishing an accurate historical record supported by documentary evidence that earlier investigators had never possessed. The court's findings ultimately recognized what the families had argued for generations. The killings had not been the result of a spontaneous frontier dispute. They had formed part of an organized conspiracy intended to obtain valuable mining property through violence and intimidation. For Walter Harlan's relatives, the ruling carried particular significance. His leather notebook, once dismissed as the habit of an overly cautious prospector, became one of the investigation's most important pieces of evidence. The careful records he had preserved finally accomplished exactly what he had always believed written documentation should do. They protected the truth. Harvey Sloan's duplicate ownership papers achieved the purpose for which he had stored them so carefully. Even though they disappeared immediately after the massacre, they ultimately exposed the fraudulent transfers that followed. Clyde Mercer's widow did not live to witness the court's decision, according to later family accounts, but her descendants attended the public acknowledgement, recognizing the victims by name. The weekly letters Clyde had faithfully written before the attack remained preserved within the family, serving as quiet reminders that his ambitions had extended far beyond op mining. He had wanted only one successful season before returning home permanently. Former co-workers of Earl McKinney remembered another kind of legacy. During the renewed public attention surrounding the case, they spoke less about the attack itself than about the man who had repaired broken equipment without expecting payment and who, during the final moments of his life, attempted to rescue another miner instead of saving himself. The investigation had established who benefited from the violence. Earl's life reminded everyone what had been lost because of it. Silver Creek itself gradually assumed a different place within Montana's history. Visitors no longer came searching only for stories of silver discoveries or forgotten mining camps. They came to understand how fragile justice could become when distance, wealth, fear, and power converge beyond the immediate reach of the law. The mountains still held the same ridges, the same forests, and the same narrow creek that had once promised extraordinary fortune. Yet the place became remembered less for the richness hidden beneath its soil than for the 10 prospectors who believed lawful ownership deserved protection, even when protecting it carried extraordinary risk. Frontier justice had often depended upon whoever possessed the strongest hand, the largest group, or the greatest willingness to use violence. Real justice arrived differently. It moved slowly. It relied upon records rather than rumors, evidence rather than intimidation, and patience rather than fear. In the end, it was not a dramatic confession or a chance discovery on the mountainside that solved Silver Creek. It was the quiet persistence of documents carefully preserved by men who believed that facts, if allowed to survive long enough, would eventually speak for themselves. Not because the mountain remembered, but because the records survived.